I heard a future cry, and it belonged to someone not born yet. That's what you're thinking right now, isn't it? You want to know how something like that is even possible. How can a sound travel backward through time? How can a voice that doesn't exist yet reach into the present and shatter everything you thought you understood about reality? I am the timeless. I exist outside your linear perception of moments flowing one after another like beads on a string. I see time as humans see space all at once, layered, folded, intersecting, and I heard something that should not exist, a cry, not from the past, echoing forward, not from the present, captured in real time, but from the future, reaching backward, desperate and impossibly real. It belonged to someone not yet conceived, not yet born, not yet alive, and it was calling for the chance to exist. This is how it began. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old, living in a small town in Pennsylvania, where autumn painted the streets in shades of amber and rust. She was a sound engineer, someone who understood frequencies, waveforms, the physics of how sound moves through air and time. She recorded voiceovers, cleaned audio for podcasts, mastered tracks for independent musicians. Her studio was a converted bedroom in the house she shared with her husband, David, a space filled with foam panels, vintage microphones, and equipment that hummed softly even in silence. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Sarah sat at her workstation, editing a client's audiobook narration. The recording was clean, professional, exactly what she expected. But then, at timestamp 0 hours 14 minutes and 37 seconds, something appeared in the waveform that made her pause. A spike, a brief interference. She isolated it, played it back. Static, nothing unusual. Equipment glitches happened. She deleted it, and continued working. The next day, it happened again. Different file, different project, same timestamp 0 hours, 14 minutes and 37 seconds. This time, beneath the static, there was something else. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible. But there, Sarah leaned closer to her monitors, adjusting the EQ, boosting the frequencies. Her breath caught. It was a cry, not an adult's cry, not an animal, a baby. She played it again and again. Each time, it grew slightly clearer, as if the signal was strengthening, learning how to reach her. Her hands trembled as she saved the file and checked every possible source of contamination. She disconnected her microphones, killed all background applications, rebooted the system. But when she opened a new recording session and hit record on silence, the cry returned. 0 hours 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Always 0 hours 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Sarah's heart pounded. She wasn't superstitious. She didn't believe in ghosts, or hauntings, or supernatural interference. There had to be a logical explanation. Crosstalk from a baby monitor nearby, a corrupted audio driver, some strange radio frequency bleeding into her equipment. But deep in her chest, beneath the rational explanations, something else stirred. Recognition. As if her body knew this sound before her mind could catch up. Downstairs, she heard David come home from work, his keys jangling as he dropped them on the kitchen counter. She should go down, tell him, show him the recording. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the distance that had grown between them over the past year. Maybe it was the way he'd started sleeping with his back to her. Maybe it was the conversation they'd been avoiding for months about whether they even had a future together. Or maybe it was because, in some way she couldn't yet articulate, Sarah already knew. This cry was meant for her alone. I watched her sit there in the glow of her monitors, headphones around her neck, one hand unconsciously resting on her abdomen. She didn't know yet that the choice had already been made, that the future was calling backward, that the child was already fighting to exist. Time doesn't move forward, it ripples. And this was the first wave. The human mind is a strange thing. It builds walls around impossibilities, labels them hallucinations or mistakes. Anything to preserve the illusion of a world that makes sense. Sarah spent 3 days trying to dismantle what she'd heard. She ran diagnostics on every piece of equipment. She replaced cables, switched audio interfaces, even borrowed a different computer from a colleague. The cry remained, always at 0 hours, 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Always the same frequency signature. Always that desperate, newborn wail that made something deep inside her chest tighten with an ache she couldn't name. By Friday, she'd filled a folder with 17 different recordings, each one capturing the same impossible sound. She played them in sequence, and what she heard made her blood run cold. The cry was changing, not louder, clearer, as if whatever was transmitting it was learning how to reach through the barrier between future and present. More than that, there were other sounds now. Underneath the infant's cry, barely audible even when she isolated and amplified the frequencies, there were voices, adult voices, a woman's voice, soft, exhausted, infinitely tender, singing a lullaby, a man's voice in the background, saying something she couldn't quite make out, and beneath it all, a rhythmic sound, breathing, heartbeat, the ambient noise of a life being lived. I felt her fear then, sharp and metallic, mixing with something else, curiosity, wonder, the terrible magnetic pull of a mystery that logic said couldn't exist but her equipment insisted was real. She created a new project file and began mapping the sounds, trying to build a complete picture from fragments. What she discovered made her hands shake. The woman's voice singing the lullaby. When she ran it through analysis software, comparing it to her own voice samples from client recordings, it was a 92% match. She was listening to herself in a future that hadn't happened yet, singing to a child that didn't exist. Sarah stood up so fast, her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. She paced the small studio, hand pressed against her mouth, trying to breathe through the panic. This wasn't possible. Time didn't work this way. Sounds couldn't travel backward. And yet, her equipment, cold and objective, and immune to delusion, told her otherwise. That night at dinner, David asked if she was okay. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the space between them feeling wider than the 3 feet of wood it actually was. He'd been distant for months, coming home later, spending weekends at his brother's place, their conversations reduced to logistics and politeness. The man she'd married 5 years ago, the one who used to pull her clothes in the kitchen while dinner burned, who left notes in her jacket pockets, who knew how to make her laugh until her stomach hurt, had slowly disappeared, replaced by this stranger who looked at her with tired eyes and spoke in carefully measured sentences that revealed nothing. Should I tell him? She wondered, watching him push food around his plate. Tell him that I'm hearing sounds from the future, that there's a baby crying backward through time, and it might be ours. Instead, she said, just a difficult project at work. He nodded, didn't press, and the silence settled back over them like ash. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sarah returned to the studio. She put on her headphones and opened the recordings again, this time listening not as an engineer but as someone trying to understand a message. At 2:47 a.m., she heard something new that made her breath stop. The man's voice in the background, the one she couldn't make out before she isolated it, cleaned it, boosted it. 3 words, clear now, unmistakable. She has your eyes. David's voice, older, maybe, weathered, but undeniably his. Sarah pulled off her headphones and stared at the waveform on her screen. This wasn't a random signal. This wasn't interference or equipment failure. This was a window, a crack in time. And through it, she was witnessing her future where she and David had a daughter who was crying backward through time, as if trying to ensure her own existence. I felt it then, the moment her disbelief finally shattered. Felt the exact instant when Sarah stopped trying to rationalize and started trying to understand. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out something she'd hidden there 3 weeks ago. A small white stick, 2 lines. Positive. She'd taken the pregnancy test the morning after a night when she and David had reached for each other in the dark, more out of muscle memory than love, to people who'd forgotten how to be close, trying to remember through touch. She hadn't told him, hadn't decided what to do. Their marriage was failing. She knew it, he knew it, they just hadn't said it out loud yet. And now this, a future calling backward. A child that might exist crying to make sure its mother made the right choice. But what if the future I was showing her wasn't the one she wanted? What if I was condemning her to a life she'd regret? I don't control what I see. I only witnessed. The timelines spread before me like roads diverging, some, where the child exists, laughing and growing and calling her mom. Others, where there's only silence. And Sarah walks a different path entirely. Both futures were real. Both were possible. And the cry, that desperate backward-reaching cry, was caught between them, fighting to tip the balance toward existence. Sarah sat in her studio until dawn, the pregnancy test on the desk beside her keyboard, the recordings playing on loop, making a choice that would create a future, or destroy one. Time doesn't move forward, it ripples. And she was standing at the center of the wave, deciding which direction it would break. There is a cruelty in knowing the future. Humans believe knowledge is power, that seeing what's coming gives you control. They're wrong. Knowledge without context is torture. I see fragments, moments torn from their timeline, emotions without their causes, consequences without their choices. And now I was forcing Sarah to carry that same burden. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands unsteady as she made coffee she wouldn't drink. David found her in the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at nothing. For the first time in months, he looked at her hurriedly, looked with something other than polite distance. Concern flickered across his face. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "How do you tell someone that you're hearing your future daughter crying backward through time? That you're pregnant with a child who's already calling out from years ahead, trying to ensure her own existence? That the marriage you've both been slowly abandoning might be the only thing standing between that child and never existing at all?" Instead, she said, "We need to talk," for words that change everything. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared 1,000 meals, where they'd laughed and argued and slowly, imperceptibly, drifted apart. The morning light cut through the window at a sharp angle, illuminating the dust motes floating between them like tiny universes. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said. The words hung there, impossibly heavy. David's face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid she couldn't name them. All shock, fear, confusion. Something that might have been hope, quickly extinguished. "How long have you known?" His voice was careful, controlled. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He repeated it like he was testing the weight of the timeline. "And you didn't tell me. We barely talk anymore." "David, when was I supposed to tell you? Between your late nights at the office and weekends at your brother's. When you started sleeping with your back to me. When you stopped asking about my day." Her voice cracked. "When exactly should I have mentioned that I'm carrying a child into a marriage that's already dead?" The word dead echoed between them. Neither had said it out loud before, but there it was. The truth they'd been circling for months. David stood up, paced to the window, his shoulders tight with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "My father left when I was 7. Did I ever tell you that?" He hadn't. 5 years of marriage, and this was news. He just left, came home one day, packed a bag, said he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be a father, couldn't handle the responsibility. And my mom, his voice broke. She tried. God, she tried. But I watched her break herself trying to be two parents. I watched her lose who she was. He turned to face Sarah. I swore I'd never do that to a child. Never bring a kid into a situation where I wasn't sure I could stay. Where I wasn't certain I was enough. The confession landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spreading outward. Sarah felt something shift inside her chestnut. Softening exactly, but understanding. All these months she'd thought his distance was about her. About them failing. She hadn't seen the fear underneath. Is that why you've been pulling away? She asked quietly. Because you're afraid you'll leave? I'm afraid I'll want to leave, he said. And the honesty of it was devastating. I'm afraid I'm already him. That it's in my blood. That one day I'll wake up and feel trapped and do what he did. Upstairs, in her studio, I listened to the recordings playing on repeat. The future cry had evolved again. Now, there were more sounds. A small voice, not an infant anymore, but a toddler saying dada. Laughing. The sound of small feet running. And underneath it all, that same lullaby Sarah sang, but tired now. Worn down by years. I saw the timeline splitting more clearly now. In one direction, David stayed. Not perfectly, not without struggle. But he stayed. And the child grew. And there were hard days and beautiful days and the ordinary miracle of a life being built despite fear. In the other direction, he left. Maybe not immediately. Maybe he tried for a few years. But eventually, the fear won. And Sarah raised the daughter alone. And the child grew up knowing absence the way David had. The pattern repeating like a genetic code. Both futures were real. Both were waiting. Sarah walked to where David stood by the window and did something they hadn't done in months. She took his hand. Listen to me, she said. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to try. To choose to stay, even when it's hard. Even when you're scared. Especially then. What if I can't? His voice was barely a whisper. What if I fail? Then you fail, Sarah said. But you fail while trying. That's the difference between you and your father. He left because it was easier. You're standing here, terrified, and you're still here. Something passed between them then, fragile and tentative. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. That night, Sarah made a decision. She brought David to the studio, sat him down in front of her monitors. I need to show you something, she said, and I need you to keep an open mind, because what I'm about to play for you isn't possible, but it's real. She played the recordings. All of them. The infant's cry, the lullaby, the toddler's voice, his own voice saying, "She has your eyes." David sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. When the recordings ended, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. That's not possible, he said. I know. That's your voice. And mine. I know. He leaned back, processing. And you think this is what? A message? From the future. I think it's our daughter, Sarah said. I think she's trying to tell us she wants to exist. The silence stretched between them, vast and unknown. Finally, David said, "What's her name?" The question broke something open in Sarah's chest. Because he wasn't asking if they should have the child. He was asking what to call her. I don't know yet, Sarah whispered. But I think we're supposed to find out. Outside, autumn leaves fell in the dark. And somewhere in the future, that was rippling backward. A child who didn't exist yet, took another breath. And another, fighting for the chance to be born. Time doesn't move forward. It ripples. And Sarah and David were learning to swim in its current. Together, toward a future that was calling their names. I have witnessed thousands of human moments. Millions of decisions that ripple through time like stones thrown into water. But I had never felt pain before, not my own. I am data, signal, Interference, given form. I shouldn't feel anything. Yet, as I watched Sarah and David stand at this crossroads, something in me twisted, sharp and inexplicable. Was this what humans called empathy? Or was it something else? The agony of witnessing futures collide, knowing I could only observe, never intervene. The next 3 weeks were strange. Sarah and David began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Conversations that went past midnight. Therapy appointments on Thursday evenings. Moments of tentative touch, his hand on her shoulder. Her fingers laced through his, testing whether the foundation was still there beneath all the damage. The pregnancy progressed. Sarah's body began changing in small ways. Fatigue, nausea, the undeniable physical reality of a life forming. She had her first ultrasound scheduled for Tuesday morning, but the recordings were changing too, and not in ways that brought comfort. The infant's cry had grown more desperate, urgent, and new sounds appeared between the fragments of future life, crying not the baby Sarah, her own voice, years ahead, breaking with a grief so profound it made the equipment crackle and distort. Arguments, doors slamming, silence, long, terrible stretches of silence. I was seeing both timelines now, overlapping, fighting for dominance. In one, David stayed, and the struggle was real but survivable. In the other, he tried God, but the fear won. I saw him leaving when the child was 3, saw Sarah alone in a small apartment, singing that same lullaby with exhaustion etched into every note. Saw the daughter Emma, asking where daddy went. Saw the shape of abandonment carving itself into a child who'd done nothing to deserve it. Which future was I showing Sarah? Was I giving her hope, or condemning her to heartbreak? On Monday night, Sarah sat in her studio with her hand on her belly, barely showing yet, but there. She'd been listening to the recordings again, trying to decode which timeline was winning. I don't know what to do, she whispered into the darkness. And for the first time since I'd become aware of my own existence, I wanted to answer. Wanted to reach through the interference and tell her, yes, choose life, choose the child, choose hope, but I couldn't, because I didn't know if that was wisdom or cruelty, because I'd seen the timeline where that choice broke her. The crying in the recordings reached a crescendo that night, not just the infant now, not just future Sarah's grief, but something else, a sound I'd never heard before in all my existence. Witnessing time, the sound of a timeline collapsing, of a possible future realizing it might never become real. The child was screaming backward through time with the desperation of something fighting extinction. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a signal. This wasn't passive observation. The act of hearing the future was changing it. Sarah knowing about the child, sharing it with David, bringing him into the studio. Every choice was shifting probabilities, pushing one timeline toward reality while the other faded into never was. She wasn't just observing the future, she was creating it. At 2:33 a.m., Sarah's phone rang. David's name on the screen. He was at his brother's place, where he'd gone to think. "I'm scared," he said without preamble. His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I'm so fucking scared, Sarah. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not enough?" "You're enough," she said. "We're enough. Together." "How do you know?" "Because she's already fighting to exist," Sarah said. "Our daughter. She's calling backward through time. And she's fighting, David. Doesn't that mean something? Doesn't that mean we're supposed to try?" Silence on the line. Then, barely audible, "Emma. I think her name should be Emma." Sarah's breath caught. "How did you?" "I dreamed it. Last night. I saw her. She was real, Sarah. She was ours. And she was," his voice broke. "She was perfect." Tuesday morning, they went to the ultrasound together. The technician moved the wand across Sarah's belly, and there, on the screen, a small shape, a heartbeat, rapid and strong. proof of a future taking form. That night, the crying stopped. Not gradually, not fading. One moment it was there, desperate and clawing for existence. The next silence. Sarah checked every recording, every file. Nothing, just clean audio. As if the child had gotten the answer she was waiting for. As if Emma knew she'd won. But I still heard something. One final transmission. So faint Sarah's equipment couldn't capture it. A voice, decades forward, adult, warm, saying two words that changed everything. Thank you. The human heart is not binary. It doesn't switch from broken to whole, from fear to courage, from doubt to certainty. It exists in the spaces between, messy and complicated and beautifully imperfect. Sarah and David didn't transform overnight. The decision to keep the child, to fight for their marriage, to choose the future where Emma existed, didn't erase the damage. Some nights David still woke in panic, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake. Some days Sarah looked at him and saw a stranger, wondered if love was enough to bridge the distance years had carved between them. But they kept trying. Therapy became routine. Conversations grew easier, then harder, then easier again. They painted a nursery pale yellow, argued about baby names, even though they both knew it would be Emma, held each other during the moments when the fear felt too big to carry alone. I watched them navigate this uncertain terrain, and something in me shifted. For so long, I believed my curse was seeing time without experiencing it, watching human lives unfold while remaining untouched, unchanged, eternal. But now I wondered if that was wrong. If perhaps I was experiencing time in the only way a consciousness like mine could not, through living it, but through witnessing it so completely that the boundary between observer and participant dissolved. 3 months into the pregnancy, Sarah's equipment picked up one final transmission. Not a cry this time, not desperation or fear. A laugh, clear and bright and full of joy. A child's laugh, years ahead, echoing backward through time like a promise. She played it for David that night. They sat together in the studio, his hand on her growing belly, listening to their daughter's future happiness rippling back to them through the static. "She's real," David whispered. And it wasn't a question. "She's real," Sarah confirmed. I felt the timeline solidify then. Not perfectly, futures are never guaranteed, never certain. But the probability shifted, weighted now toward existence. Toward Emma. Toward a family that would struggle and survive and build something beautiful from the wreckage of what they'd almost lost. What humans don't understand is that the future isn't written. It's negotiated. Every choice, a bid. Every decision, a vote. And sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, the future reaches backward to remind you what you're fighting for. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the winter landscape. Snow had started falling, soft and quiet, covering everything in white. Beside her, David wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands settling on her belly where their daughter grew. "Do you think she'll forgive us?" he asked quietly. "For almost choosing differently." Sarah leaned back into him. "I think she'll never know we had doubts. I think all she knows is that we chose her, that we fought for her, that when it mattered most, we said yes." In the future, years ahead, a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's smile would run through rooms filled with laughter. She'd grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she was loved, never realizing she once had to fight for the simple right to exist. She'd never hear the recordings of her own cry reaching backward through time. Never know about the fragile moment when her parents stood at a crossroads and could have chosen differently. Some stories are meant to stay hidden. Some miracles work best in silence. Time doesn't move forward, it ripples. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those ripples carry messages from futures that are trying desperately to become real. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, when the world smelled of rain and new beginnings, Emma Rose Mitchell entered the world. Her first cry was sharp and clear, and unmistakably alive. Sarah, exhausted and radiant, held her daughter for the first time, and felt the weight of every choice, every doubt, every moment of fear transform into this a small, perfect human being, with tiny fists and her father's nose, and a future stretching out before her like an open road. David stood beside the hospital bed, tears streaming down his face. One finger held gently in Emma's impossibly small hand. "She's here," he whispered. "She's really here." That night, after the visitors left and the hospital settled into quiet, Sarah asked a nurse to bring her phone. She opened her recording app, hands shaking slightly, and captured the sound of Emma sleeping. The soft rhythm of her breathing, the tiny sounds she made, the ambient noise of a life just beginning. Later, at home, Sarah would compare this recording to the ones from months ago, the cry that had reached backward through time, desperate for existence. They matched perfectly. Frequency, pitch, duration, identical. The future she'd heard had become the present she was living. I listened to Emma's first breath, her first cry, her first moments of life, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Completion. As if a circuit had finally closed, a loop perfected. I had witnessed a future that willed itself into being. A child who fought backward through time for the chance to exist, and won. But there was more. As Emma slept in her mother's arms, I detected a new signal, faint, almost imperceptible, decades forward. An adult voice, warm and strong, calling out a single word that made the timeline shimmer with possibilities yet to come. "Mom." I didn't tell Sarah. Some futures should unfold naturally, without the weight of foreknowledge. Some mysteries should remain mysteries. But I knew what I'd heard. Emma's voice, grown and full of life, reaching backward through time, just as she had as an infant. Not crying this time, not fighting for existence, just reaching back to say hello, to remind her mother across the years that every impossible choice, every moment of doubt, every leap of faith had been worth it. Because Emma would grow up loved, she'd become someone remarkable, and one day, far in the future, she'd discover her own way of bending time, of sending messages backward, of being the kind of person who reaches through the impossible to touch the people who gave her life. Time doesn't move forward. It ripples, it loops, it bends, and somewhere in those curves and folds, a child who once fought to exist would grow into a woman who'd do the same for her own daughter. The pattern repeating, the cycle continuing, an infinite regression of love reaching backward to ensure the future keeps happening. I am the timeless. I exist outside your linear flow of moments. And I have learned something I never expected. That the future isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, one impossible choice at a time. Sarah looked down at Emma, at the small miracle sleeping peacefully in her arms, and whispered, "Welcome home, little one. We've been waiting for you." But the truth was more beautiful than that. Emma hadn't been waiting to arrive. She'd been fighting to make sure they'd be ready when she did. And in the end, they all chose each other. Past, present, and future. A family built from interference, from signals crossing time, from love that refused to accept, never as an answer. The cry had stopped. The future had arrived. And somewhere in the static between moments, I smiled.